Welcome to our lecture on finding and using scientific information. Just to give you a quick summary of what today's lecture looks like, we'll start with an introduction, a very basic walk through the UC library. We'll then consider how do we know what we really know. We'll then focus on finding scientific evidence based on the book Rethinking Sport and Exercise Psychology Research, and finish off with how we use scientific evidence based on Being a Sports Psychologist by Richard Keegan. So, what about using the right tools? The library website from the University of Canberra is incredibly useful. If it's something you're not familiar with, then I suggest you make it a part of your bookmarks. I use it almost every day when looking for something peer-reviewed and relevant. As long as you know what you are looking for, this is the place to go. So you just start by using the search bar like any other search bar, specifically looking for the name of the article or its specific identification number or its DOI. You make sure you actually know who the authors are, because sometimes irrelevant suggestions may also appear. And we're looking for the available online in green underneath the title that you're looking for. And that means that you can actually access a version online. So if you click into the article that you're looking for, this is what the next page will look like. At the bottom, it'll show you a link to where that online version is stored. Not all of the links work, so be careful of that. But for the majority of the time, there will be a full text available as a PDF to download if you use this site. More importantly, though, how do we know that we really know? And there's a great example in the book about using scientific evidence. So is the scientific evidence you're looking for actually scientific? And a great way to consider this is looking at the conclusion on the right and considering any flaws that you might see. So our conclusion here is that an exercise psychologist recruited 10 patients diagnosed with major depression. After 4 months of jogging 3 times per week, the average score on an established depression inventory was significantly lower than at the pre-test. The researcher concluded that exercise is a reliable treatment for those suffering depression. While this sounds like a nice conclusion, there are a few questions that we need to know the answers to. Were there any spontaneous changes over time considered? A control group would have enabled the researcher to compare those who exercised with those who didn't to really know if the exercise intervention was the reason why they saw a difference. How depressed were the participants to begin with? A diagnosis only stipulates certain symptoms are present, so what do we really know about depression? Were there other differences among the exercises? There could be a number of individual differences that could attribute to the change in depression levels. And how many, if any, did already perform some form of regular physical exercise? Because this is going to influence whether or not they're capable of completing the intervention, but also if it added to potential differences in their lifestyles. Now, a great way to highlight whether we know something we think we know is the myth of learning styles. And this is still incredibly prevalent to this day. It's the idea that we had 3 different types of learning styles. You had the kinesthetic learner, an auditory learner, or a visual learner. And it was based on the idea that the way that we learn is centered on something that we can do, hear, or see, and that people had a preference towards one or the other. But it turns out that there is a significant amount of evidence to the contrary, and yet this idea still prevails. So how common is the belief in learning styles, and does it matter? There's a wonderful review at the end of this link that will show you why this is so easy to believe and is perpetuated in our understanding, but it actually turns out to be a neuromyth. We'll get into finding scientific evidence now, all about where do we look and what makes it good. Critical thinking in sport and exercise psychology is incredibly important, and there are a few things that distinguish a critical thinker. They need to be capable of taking a position and or changing a position as evidence dictates. They remain relevant to the point. They seek information as well as precision in information. They're open-minded. They take into account the entire situation. They keep the original problem in mind. So, learning the virtues of scientific reasoning and the nature of science is not sufficient to help students develop their critical thinking. And therefore, their scientific reasoning skills are also underdeveloped. And that was a quote as criticism from Schmaltz and Lilienfeld about the APA guidelines and what they set out as the learning outcomes for undergraduate psychology students. There's a couple more, we go up to 12. Critical thinkers also search for reason. They deal with the components of a complex problem in an orderly manner. They seek a clear statement of the problem. They look for options. They exhibit sensitivity to others' feelings and knowledge. And they use credible sources. It's a great quote on the side. Critical thinking is about how to think, not about what to think. And while we have 12 different things here to distinguish critical thinkers, that quote is what stuck with me the most. A great place to start when critically thinking about sport and exercise psychology is whether there is a hierarchy of scientific methods. Now, there's always been a preference that experimental research is the pinnacle, and that's according to Boring in 1929, almost 100 years ago now. And much of the discussion about critical thinking is actually based on the experimental method. We had the randomized control trials as the gold standard, and all other experimental methods are judged against this standard. It means we emphasize the importance of quality design when we're establishing scientific findings. And there are some threats and problems that can undermine the integrity of a formal experiment that we need to take into consideration. But was Boring themselves thinking critically? They thought that experimental method was by far the best. It was the only method they regarded as sufficiently objective to produce reliable and valid results in a world polluted by subjective and unreliable methods. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds a little more cynical than critical to me. There's also a great quote to finish by Teo, which says, tradition is the source of knowledge, but also limits knowledge. And as someone who has researched in an area of tradition, especially elite sport and talent development, I can definitely show you where some of those limits are. So should we be adapting sports psychology to fit within the scientific method? Or have we hindered our ability to design the methods needed to understand sport and exercise psychology? What we do with the information is actually founded upon how we access it. We have an initiative called the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which actually recognizes that users have a lot of rights to the articles and scientific knowledge that we're presenting. But for an article to be open access, where you can just go straight online and download it for free yourself, without needing to look at the institution library, for example, like we started in this lecture, authors or institutions have to pay for that open access, and it can be up to several $1,000s. There is also a rise of predatory journals and standalone publishers, which don't necessarily align to anything in particular. They don't necessarily have to be peer-reviewed. There's no checking process into what they're presenting, and so they might look really scientific, but there's usually a question about how realistic they are. It's also worth noting that not all open access journals are actually peer-reviewed, which means to be checked by other academics before it is published. We cannot simply accept claims just because they appear as a scholarly journal article, and peer reviewers actually act as the gatekeepers to knowledge. They make sure that we're keeping honest, that our methods are up to standard, and that we're presenting information in a scientific way. But not everybody understands science. There's a great quote in the book. It's a classical quote. It's been heard many times before. It says, "There are lies, damned lies, and statistics," which essentially translates into you can prove anything with statistics. And if you present it in the right way, I'm sure that is true to some people. And so scientifically illiterate people may actually be unaware of simple truths like the Earth orbits the sun. So 74% of all Americans believe that this is to be the case, while 26% believe it's actually the other way around. So it's not only research oriented, but research can be really difficult to understand. For somebody to be considered scientifically literate, that person should be able to ask, find, or determine answers to questions derived from curiosity about everyday experiences, and they have the ability to describe, explain, and predict natural phenomena. Somebody who is scientifically literate also implies the capacity to pose and evaluate arguments based on evidence, to apply conclusions from such arguments appropriately. So this is not just about being able to read an article and understand what it's telling you, but then to apply the information that you have just gleaned from that argument, and how you would then use it. We're believed to have two different systems that work in the brain simultaneously. We have the automatic or fast system, system 1, and controlled and slow as system 2. Now, they believe that system 1 continuously generates suggestions to system 2 through impressions, intuitions, intentions, and feelings, the things that happen straight away. If they are endorsed by system 2, they turn into beliefs, and impulses turn into voluntary actions. So there are a number of things that we do really automatically or really quickly without considering them. And this is one of the reasons why Thinking Fast and Slow, that very famous book, turned so many heads when it came out, because this idea that you can stop and consider whether or not a thought is an impression or an intuition, maybe even an intention or a feeling, rather than something conscious and voluntary, then you should be able to mediate the effects between the two. I loved finding this quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who spends a lot of time trying to help people become scientifically literate, especially as an astrophysicist himself. He saw a 14-year-old student at a science fair who had invited people to sign a petition that demanded either the strict control of or a total ban on dihydrogen monoxide. So 86% of passers-by actually voted to ban water, because dihydrogen monoxide is literally 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, or H2O. Maybe that's what really happened to all the water on Mars. So understanding science and the way it is communicated and written and what it means is actually really important in day-to-day life. We also need to do a bit of myth busting. So there is a consideration that some elements of science don't meet the standards that have been put forward by experimental methods. And this has sort of created a subversion of science, or a pseudoscience. Being able to distinguish the two can be difficult. As you can see, science is very much based on what we can measure and what we can see. So its claims are reasonable and within boundaries. They can be reproduced, they can be falsified, they are cumulative, so they grow over time. They're self-correctable, and they're not overly complicated. And when we've reviewed models and theories in the past, these are the criteria that we've been speaking about consistently as to whether or not they are being met. In terms of pseudoscience, it's easy to trick people into believing something because we want to believe. It's part of being human, but it's also something that people take advantage of. People who write pseudoscience or conduct pseudoscience often avoid peer-reviewed journals as their outlet, because their findings would then be opened to scrutiny by their peers. A great way to exemplify this is the concept of key. It's allegedly an invisible energy force in traditional Chinese medicine influenced by meditation, but it's really difficult to measure. So how do we know it's really there? So pseudoscience also notably lacks clear links to extant knowledge as well. It's not really based on anything. So as we go deeper into finding scientific evidence, we need to understand the status of theory, and there are 4 different views outlined in the book. We have Kuhn's perspective, which is that theory is part of the furniture of paradigm. It takes the form of metaphysical assumptions that guide identification and solving of puzzles in periods of normal science. And so a theory is uncritically accepted and defended by a community of scientists as it forms part of the way they bond together, making scientific activity possible in the first place. So theory is a fundamental element of a paradigm, and it fits in a specific way. Popper actually believed that theory is a fallible solution to a problem, which must be subjected to criticism in order to maintain progress. Its well-defined scientific theories enable us to develop expectations or make predictions and are therefore testable. Those that survive the criticism are maintained tentatively until harsher tests can be developed. Lakatos had a different view as well. They argued that only groups of theories or research programs can actually be considered scientific. They also suggested the criticism of theory is not so simple, since a research program is made up of a hardcore theory, often with a predictive belt of hypotheses that make simple criticism and overthrow highly unlikely. Now, they largely agreed with Popper, but the idea is that there is this central idea that governs everything that a research program does, and then surrounding that is actually a buffer that makes it really difficult to access that core theory. And finally, we have Feyerabend, who holds that there are only theories. So scientists move forward by creating or reviving bold theories and putting them into competition with one another. There are no rules to method on this view, and progress is achieved by breaking received rules, violating accepted standards, and inventing better alternatives. It's quite a radical view by contrast. Let's take a moment to consider theory in the present moment in sport and exercise psychology. What does theory look like? Well, in the book, they performed a case study using a popular area of research in the last 5 years. Motivation research drawing on self-determination theory using cross-sectional questionnaires and correlation methods was identified. To perform the case study, they drew on systematic literature review principles and processes. So they searched a database between the years 2010 and 2015 with the phrases of self-determination theory and correlation or regression in the abstract. They added a few limiters that it had to be published in English, and the journal had to have an impact factor. So in the end, they found 24 papers. They wanted to answer these 2 questions. What is the purpose of the theory as conceptualized in the paper, and how are the findings reported vis-a-vis the theory? So the purpose of the review was to determine the extent to which researchers in this highly popular subfield are following an identifiable philosophical tradition, hence theory as a framework. Now, self-determination theory itself has a series of mini-theories, and the ones that they were considered in this study were cognitive evaluation theory, organismic integration theory, causality orientations theory, and basic psychological needs theory. So the mini-theories themselves represent a rich source of hypotheses for understanding and predicting human behavior. When answering question 1, which is what was the purpose, a framework or perspective from which to conduct research was claimed to be the purpose in 14 out of the 24 papers. So it was simply a way of looking at the world and equipping researchers with a set of concepts and tools to explore motivation. That's the role that self-determination theory plays. The rest of the 10 papers actually claimed it was a model for making and testing predictions, which is actually slightly misleading because they all claim to be testing a model or hypotheses derived from the model, and none specified conditions under which that model would be rejected. So what are they actually testing? If you think about it, the first element of question 1 actually aligns with the Kuhnian paradigm. It's this idea that there is a metaphysical theory at its center, and there's a cluster of substantive theories to guide setting and solving problems. So the way that they described a framework or a perspective is how they used self-determination theory aligns with the way that Kuhn thought about theory. In terms of question 2, which was reporting vis-a-vis the theory, 13 out of the 24 papers actually simply stated that the findings supported self-determination theory. So they typically claimed findings supported or confirmed hypothesized links, doing very little to actually extend the paradigm. And if they did, it was in very small or piecemeal steps. They found a new sample group or a subdiscipline or combined it with other theories. Authors claimed that partial support for self-determination theory in the other papers, but they explained away anomalies with references to cultural, contextual, or even individual difference factors. So again, the first half supporting this idea of substantive theories guiding and setting problems to solve, but when something was different or didn't fit within the model, we just explained it away. So in conclusion of that case study, most authors actually treated self-determination theory as a paradigm, explicitly or implicitly, in the Kuhnian sense that it provides a conceptual language and toolbox for studying a wide range of motivation. But it does not occur to actually test the theory itself. It provides some of the most basic assumptions and conceptual tools of motivation, but it would be bold or somewhat foolish to criticize something as well established as self-determination theory if you want to be able to publish anything. And so it's really difficult to test the theory when it's so well ingrained, and it's so much easier to get your work out there if it aligns with something this well established. Kuhn actually argues that paradigms bring an immense restriction of vision, so it results in an inability to see phenomena that do not fit. I think that was very clear in the way that they explained anomalies. What about the other perspective? So if you took a Popperanian perspective, dealing with anomalies was done similar to how we consider pseudoscience. Anything that didn't fit didn't also affect the theory itself, and we just found excuses. The accumulation of anomalies actually should preempt a revolution. It should be an indicator that change should be made to the theory, but we don't know where that tipping point is, and it's hard to find. It also makes you question how much of the claims were methodological errors or stretching an ad hoc hypothesis, which means trying to apply the original thought that you had after the fact just to make it fit. On the other side, if you take a Lakatosian or a Feyerabend perspective, constructive criticism actually mobilizes perspectives or rival programs, and it creates more progressive ones. So the lack of serious consideration for rival programs is a big warning bell here. Degenerating programs don't make novel predictions and simply explain what is already known, and that's essentially what they've done here. So the absence of bold and novel predictions and overlooking anomalies by patching up their findings means that they weren't really contributing. When we look at the qualitative side, we have the notion of generating grounded theories, which is a methodological approach to generating substantive theories which are grounded in empirical data. a legitimate but opposite approach to the more dominant deductive or theory-driven approach that we've just discussed. There have been 38 papers in 22 years in sport and exercise psychology based on grounded theories, and there are 3 different versions that we need to understand based on the philosophical foundations of the authors. We have the Glazerian version, Straussian version with Juliet Corbin, and the constructivist version with Kathy Charmé. There are actually a number of common features about grounded theories that these authors agree on. Grounded theory studies actually begin with and are continuously influenced by theoretical sensitivity, which means researchers bring prior knowledge to investigations, which influences how they ask questions and interpret the data. It poses the question of how to use existing knowledge during an investigation, not whether or not it exists. And it means the difference between keeping an open mind and not an empty head. We also have theoretical sampling, which means the sample is based on a desire to check out emerging theory or hypotheses. The goal is to develop, flesh out, and refine concepts and strategies, and the way we sample is influenced by the knowledge that we're trying to find. We also have the constant comparative method, which is data collection and analysis occurring in tandem. It generates mutually exclusive concepts with clearly defined properties. Now, you're probably wondering where validity and reliability fits into this situation. So we also have the notion of rigor. Rigor is usually used in quantitative studies, and it's not quite the word that we use for qualitative measures. When we think about rigor instead, it's more about credibility, plausibility, and the trustworthiness of work. We also have the notion of theoretical saturation. And so we conclude the study when gaps in a theory are almost, if not completely, filled. New data actually stops emerging, and it no longer adds anything to the theoretical picture. Now, on the left is actually from my personal research on professionalism in women's cricket. This is what a hierarchy chart looks like. We have our overarching themes, the themes that also fit within them. And this was a constant process. Every time we spoke to someone new, we would add something in that they had contributed. And we knew to stop sampling for people when nobody was adding anything to this theory. The difference about grounded theory is that it should explain all the variations in the data above which it sits, meaning it's anchored or grounded. In terms of a quality assessment criteria, it needs to fit, work, have relevance, and be modifiable. A theory should fit the data, it should work for and be relevant to the participants, and modifiable in writing to increase its clarity. And grounded theory label is being adopted by sport and exercise psychology researchers because it is fashionable and it confers legitimacy on qualitative approaches about which there is a widespread lack of understanding. And this is a really key quote here from Weiss because they conducted a critical review of the use of grounded theory. And there's a reason for it. So Popper, Kuhn, and Feyerabend demolish the ideas of individual objectivity, theory, neutral observation, certainty, and truth, which are a lot of the foundations of how we understand grounded theory. As such, sport and exercise psychologists are desperately searching for methodological legitimacy or even security in a sea of doubt. Grounded theory, with its tools, its techniques, procedures, and processes, represents an attractive solution. So the critical review highlighted that 2 of 12 papers sampled from the past 10 years actually earned the label of grounded theory, and they judged that based on 8 core elements. They accused the authors of 10 pseudo-grounded theory papers of dabbling and having no real commitment to the appropriate application of grounded theory. These are probably the kinds of people who are just looking for a model to use when they're approaching qualitative research. They also claim that grounded theory is a complete package or total methodology, not a pick and mix box of techniques, which can be really difficult to grasp. When Weed's review was also reviewed, the number of papers expanded to 17. And Holt and Tamminen actually tended to agree with the 8 core elements, but didn't necessarily agree with how they were categorized as yes or no in terms of meeting the standards. The reason a review of a review was made was to undermine, in a legitimate way, the fundamentalist stance that we took as the methods police. They were arguing that one gatekeeper or viewpoint cannot do justice to such a diverse methodology. So, what should you try then? Well, stick with one approach. Understand what your perspective is and which one matches you and the work that you're trying to achieve. You also need to show how that approach was appropriate to the research question too. So it's not just about you, but also what you're trying to find. So there were still 2 main problems to debate. The first being there was an agreement over the essential elements of grounded theory as a result of the 2 reviews, and the book didn't quite like that. It assumes that faithful application of 8 elements means a quality substantive theory emerges, and there are alternative characteristics, elements, whatever you want to call them. So agreeing on a definitive list is questionable at best. At least 4 of the 8 elements contains serious philosophical problems, including induction, theoretical sensitivity, sampling, and saturation. And then another review found 19 out of 25 papers applied grounded theory only at the data analysis stage. So they didn't even use constant comparative process. The second problem to debate was the suggestion that researchers choose specific internally consistent variants of grounded theory. But all variants contain significant philosophical misunderstandings, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose as long as you're consistent. Glaser maintains a positivist approach, which is actually a growing critique for that particular stance, while Straussian and constructivists are more sophisticated. But Charmes often writes from an implicit critical realist stance, and Strauss and Corbin claim interpretive approach, but fail to address the problems with induction. So there's a lot of gaps in our understanding of grounded theory and the techniques that govern its use. Let's step back and go through what a research paradigm really is. So paradigms may be viewed as a set of basic beliefs that deal with ultimates or first principles. They represent a worldview that defines, for its holder, the nature of the world, the individual's place in it, and the range of possible relationships to that world and its parts, as cosmologies or theologies do. Now, cosmologies is the study of how the world began, with the prevailing theory being the Big Bang Theory, and of course, theologies is the study of the nature of God and religion. So all research throughout history has been affected by what the performing researcher either personally or collectively considers to be good research. There are philosophical differences between paradigms, and there are 3 fundamental questions that we can ask ourselves, where the answers reveal the basic beliefs that make it possible to distinguish between them. We have the ontological question, which is focused on the nature of the world. What can we as researchers gain knowledge about in our surrounding world? The epistemological question is, what is the relationship between the researcher and what is being researched? And thirdly, our methodological question. How do we gain or go about getting knowledge of the world? So the first stage is the beliefs that are held by the researcher as to the nature of the world. The second stage is whether or not it is possible to even obtain objective knowledge, or if knowledge by its very nature is subjective. And thirdly, what influences methodology and the subsequent methods that are deemed appropriate to find what we're looking for. Let's dive into research paradigms a little deeper. Firstly, we have positivism, which is a classical view, and it assumes that it is possible to study a single external reality objectively. We can then draw conclusions and make generalizations that are independent of context and time. The researcher has direct access to the real world and is a detached, external observer that neither influences nor is influenced by what is being studied. Manipulating independent variables is very highly valued. They experimentally test hypotheses, establish cause and effect, and they usually use quantitative methods with statistical analyses. A great way to think about it is that there is but one single reality that can be studied independently without bias by an objective researcher, but this has recently been considered naive, reductionist, and deterministic. Post-positivism is sometimes described as an evolution of positivism. It's more subdued and flexible, still studying reality, but aware that their study can never be unbiased. The researcher's mindset has to be critical. It focuses on measurements and to operationalize concepts. Reliability and validity are considered critically important and are often discussed at length in papers. Quantitative methodology with a preference for control extraneous variables in order to determine if independent variables are causally related to the dependent variable. A summary is that there is but one reality, but it cannot be studied independent of context and time. It's also known as critical realism and is used by most sports psychologists at the moment. Critical theory is actually an umbrella term for ideas influenced by ideology. Its knowledge is never considered objective, value-free, or completely free of bias. Its findings are shaped by values or values mediated, stemming from cultural, economic, ethnic, feminist, gender or queer, political and social issues. It's a critical framework to adhere to, and its ultimate goal is to facilitate social change and deliberately questions the status quo. In other words, research and its communication is often biased towards an overrepresented population of pale, male, and stale. So findings are shaped by values to achieve social change. And constructivism is also labeled as interpretivism. It fundamentally is different to positivism and post-positivism. They believe that reality is not an objective entity. The individual constructs it, as many realities as there are individuals exist. The interpretive approach to unravel meaning is considered writing fiction in some cases, with no objective truth to reveal, only subjective and somewhat unreliable experiences. Its ideographic approach is necessary to reveal perceived truth and understand implicit and tacit knowledge. So reality is actually constructed within the person and between people. It may be considered fiction writing, but it provides a deep understanding of lived experience. Our research paradigm also helps us understand how we go about measuring constructs. And we have two examples here of what measuring constructs looks like. In terms of burnout, this was first made measurable by Maslach and Jackson in 1981 with their burnout inventory. It was then described as a syndrome with 3 dimensions: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a lack of personal accomplishment, but that wasn't as highly correlated with the others. A sports version uses emotional and physical exhaustion and disengagement with unique questionnaires for athletes and for coaches. These dimensions have remained relatively unchanged even to this day. But in qualitative research, burnout's believed to be more multifaceted and complex. The lack of newer, more comprehensive instruments is actually somewhat surprising, but it's easier to get published with established models. Peer reviewers actually have a lot to lose if better instruments replace their life's work, and the standards for testing in psychology recognize that constructs are commonly underrepresented when testing, only seeing a very narrow view of the construct. In fact, their quote is, "Nearly all tests leave out elements that some believe should be measured," which is not reassuring in the slightest. On the other hand, if we look at something like achievement goals, motivation was believed to be directed towards some type of goal, and it fluctuates with intensity and over time. Nichols described children in educational settings by either evaluating their competence in relation to own past performances or performance of others. The first is known as a mastery goal, or the second as a performance or ego goal. To measure achievement goals, two instruments were developed simultaneously with a similar number of items per subscale. It had to reflect achievement goal theory. Now, this reflection isn't incredibly useful because we place the emphasis on the results of the questionnaires. We may not be fully understanding achievement goals themselves, and the study will only reflect what the questionnaires measure. If future scales must be coherent with achievement goal theory, all that really means is that it must suit one very narrow version of achievement goal theory, and as such, any major breakthroughs are unlikely. Now we'll move on to using scientific evidence based on the book Being a Sports Psychologist by Richard Keegan. We'll start with case formulation, and being able to use and find scientific evidence becomes really integral at this stage. When working with a client, there are vital principles to keep in mind when choosing or developing working models to use in the case formulation process. So they make predictions we can test against experience, either our own or those of the client. The working model must make bold and clear predictions, otherwise the theory is damaged when it's wrong. They should exclude as many options as possible, leaving us with a clear way forwards. And better theories actually distinguish themselves by predicting things that others do not. So we should embrace and test rather than ignore deviant theories. We again consider what validity and reliability means in the real world of being a sports psychologist. And validity refers to whether we're actually measuring what we intend to, whereas reliability refers to the consistency of a measurement. Within case formulation, we look at validity as predictive validity. It's more relevant this way, and it makes us question if our model accurately predicts future events or outcomes of future actions. Reliability in this case means that if different psychologists reach the same formulations when presented with the same client details, and it actually may be more important for a formulation to be a coherent and defensible account of a person's presenting concerns than to actually be replicable by another psychologist. So we also need to consider what we're trying to do in this situation and why. Let's have a look at two different perspectives to understand what case formulation would look like. So a positivist, or described as certainism, tradition in the book would seek to fit the client's data in with existing theory and or research. Questionnaires are often directly and deliberately compatible with a parent theory, as we saw before with achievement goals. It minimizes the necessity of inferences or the guesswork in attempting case formulation, which can be really useful. It places the trust in the veracity of a relevant theory and uses it to derive ideas for interventions. But even relatively simple models can offer many potential intervention strategies, which could be useful or useless. In terms of pragmatism, this is the idea that what works is right. And because the goalposts often move during provision of support, we might replace worked with generate positive change for the client. If the strategy appears to work, then on some level you must have known something about the underlying mechanics and structures, and this is what pragmatism is based on. It might actually be more suitable for monitoring, evaluation, and reflection than it is for case formulation. Because if you approach an issue with no explanatory model or theory, either nothing will get done or a fairly random and inexplicable pattern of suggested incongruent interventions might occur. So how do we choose a support strategy knowing what we know? Well, defining choosing a support strategy is the process wherein one course of action or intervention or treatment is selected from many possible alternatives. So we are recognizing that there are possible alternatives. It's up to you to find a way to choose a specific support strategy. The intervention choice is inextricably linked to the needs analysis, the case formulation, intervention planning, and monitoring. So this doesn't happen in isolation, but the act of choosing an intervention is a defining feature of the helping profession, and it's a key feature on which our work is judged. If our support strategy is demonstrably effective, theoretically appropriate, and transparent or logical, then it'll be science. So there are 3 elements that they discuss in the book around choosing a support strategy. They are the stage of case formulation, which is clearly identifying a suitable working model of your client's current needs, abilities, situation, and goals. We then have evidence-based practice, which is a conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of an individual patient. And also we have professional judgment, which is a permitted degree of discretion or autonomy in your decision making as part of the profession. We're actually going to focus on evidence-based practice, given this is a lecture about finding and using scientific information. So evidence-based practice requires that decisions about healthcare are based on the best available, current, valid, and relevant evidence. These decisions should be made by those receiving care, informed by the tacit and explicit knowledge of those providing care, and within the context of available resources. So if we want to say a particular intervention or strategy works in the sense of improving performance, then we really do need evidence to support that claim. It is worth noting that this is highly compatible with the positivist or certainism approach. But elite athletes are also a special population and they come with their own ceiling effects. So maybe there is a limit to how good they can really get. Gardner and Moore proposed levels of evidential support. They were well established, probably efficacious, and experimental. So to be well established, the intervention must demonstrate efficacy in at least 2 good between groups experiments, and in at least 2 of the following ways. Either superiority to a placebo, so the control group is actually getting something, it's not just they didn't get the intervention. It could be equivalence to already well-established treatment with an adequate sample size, or a large series of single case design experiments demonstrating effectiveness. When we're using scientific information, especially to inform how we provide support and care for another person, we need to consider the information that we're using to criticize it, to critically analyze it, and determine what it could potentially do. We have proposed levels of evidential support to make sure that when we are basing our case formulation on scientific information, that we understand the implications of that work, where it came from, what it aims to do, what it potentially predicts, and what may happen as a result. And we need to be confident in those decisions because ultimately we are influencing the experience of another person based on our decision. When we're suggesting something to another person, what are we using as supporting evidence? And hopefully it's scientific information. So I wanted to leave you with a few reflection questions to take away. The first being, how do you view the world? And how does that influence reality and how you measure it? How do you really know what we know? And from what perspective does that knowledge come from? Are you a critical thinker in and about sports psychology research? And how much evidence do you need before designing an intervention for your client? You may never get to this stage. You may never see clients as a sports psychologist, but finding an evidence base and establishing what you need to know before you give it to somebody else is a really important threshold to understand. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.